Thank you so much for joining. We are so excited that you are here to learn about, kind of what we've been learning through this research and what Brady's really dug into in the state of nonprofit donation page study. Before we really get going, I want to make a quick mention of Raise Donors, who this webinar, this research, none of this real study would be brought to you without the help of Raise Donors. They are our key sponsor. They're super great. They're a donation page tool. They're donation page platforms. You can check them out. They integrate with a lot of different tools out there that you're likely using today. We often recommend them. They're a great tool, especially for testing. So feel free to check them out. And again, huge shout out, huge thanks to them for helping sponsor this study, and making sure that we can bring this level of research to you to hopefully help you find new ways that you can increase revenue, you can increase conversion rates on your donation page, and start seeing even greater generosity from your donors. So again, huge shout out to Raise Donors. Thanks so much. A few housekeeping things before we get going, and just a few announcements too. We have a brand new workshop that's coming up at Bloomerang's office in Indianapolis. It's on August 15th. It's really about this topic of online fundraising optimization. And so we're looking at kind of a high level. What are the core pieces that really go into building an online fundraising program? What are some of the key learnings that you need to have an understanding of to really see real growth, both in email fundraising, on donation pages? How do you start to implement testing and optimization into your program? So it's a certification level training. You'll spend all day together with us at the Bloomerang office. You'll get a big manual, a training manual with fill in the blanks and notes and tools and all that type of stuff to really help you get going with optimizing and really building up your online fundraising program to see growth. You can find out more about that at nextafter.com/training. Be sure to register for that soon if you want to come. In addition to that, we've got a few other things too that I want you to be aware of, and then we'll get into the webinar. But NEO Summit is our annual event, our annual conference we put on called the Nonprofit Innovation and Optimization Summit. It's September 24th through 25th in Denver, Colorado this year. It's a super cool event. We bring in 16, 17, 18 plus speakers each year, kind of in a single track. So you'll hear every single speaker going through different topics like optimization and copywriting, content marketing, donor psychology, SEO, donor acquisition, how to use Facebook to really find new audiences and new people. Really kind of a holistic view of an online fundraising program. And what I think is so cool about this event is that most of these people aren't the typical speakers you might expect to have at a nonprofit conference. A lot of them are hand-selected from for-profit events because they have really cool, unique, innovative strategies that I think will be super beneficial and helpful for you as you're growing your fundraising. If you're interested in coming, be sure to get your ticket either tonight or tomorrow because there's a buy one, get one free ticket sale going on. It ends at 11:59 p.m. tomorrow evening. That's Central Time. So be sure to check it out and get your ticket as soon as you can. Prices will go up after tomorrow. A few things about the webinar specifically. Actually, well, sorry, I forgot about the podcast. How can I forget about the podcast? Some of you I know are active listeners and avid listeners. We've got a brand new episode coming out tomorrow. Brady just recorded an interview even just a couple of hours ago. But it's called the Generosity Freak Show. We're talking about, what are some really innovative ideas that can help not just move the needle in online fundraising, but in generosity as a whole. Subscribe wherever you get podcasts, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, Google Store, wherever you get podcasts, we are there. And then about the webinar specifically, some of you have asked, just to clarify, there will be a video recording available to you later. We try to send that out in a few hours after the webinar, once the recording processes and all that stuff. So we'll send that out to you along with the slides this evening. We'll also send, some additional links and resources and things that Brady mentions today. But then maybe most importantly, we will have time for Q&A at the end. We're going to try to make time. Brady just told me just before we jumped on here that he's got a lot of content to get through. So we may go a little over an hour, maybe an hour 15, an hour 20. So hopefully you have time to stick around. If not, again, we'll have the recording. But if you have questions as we go through today, feel free to use this chat box on the right side of your screen, or if you're on mobile, it should be right below the video player. You can ask your questions, drop your comments in there. I'm going to be watching those, and I'll come back at the end after Brady's done sharing what he's been learning, and we'll talk about those questions and try to get some answers. Again, Brady is our speaker today. I'm going to not spend too much time talking him up because Brady's the bomb, and you're going to hear that as he goes through this whole presentation. So without further ado, Brady Josephson.
Thanks, Nathan. I think Brady's the bomb is my new bio. That's what I'm going to use. So hopefully I can live up to that. As mentioned, we're here to talk about nonprofit donation pages and some new research. I've been trying hard for weeks now to figure out a way to share this information in a useful way, in a concise way. And I'm going to do my best. I will go quick. We probably won't make it in under an hour, but hopefully you'll find a ton of useful stuff. So get those pencils sharpened and ready. So I'm going to dive in. First question that we often get is, so why on earth do you do these studies? There's really three reasons why we do this study in particular. And the first is just to unleash generosity. This is our mission and our vision. We want to unleash the most generous generation in the history of the world. Now, how that relates specifically to research and donation pages is this. When it comes to online fundraising in particular, which is where we are focused, there's really only three ways for you to grow online revenue. You can either get more traffic or more people to visit your website. You can get more people who visit to donate. That's your conversion rate. Or you can get those people who actually go on to make a gift to be more generous or actually give more. That's your average gift. Now, your donation page plays an absolutely critical role in two of those, the conversion rate and the average gift. The traffic and who they are and the quality also plays a role, but to keep it simple, your donation page plays a very critical role in conversion and average gift. So it has a huge role to play in just growing online revenue. And we have a lot of room to improve. So when we look at conversion rates, earlier this year, we did our own benchmark study. Some of you may have participated in it. Thank you. And when we looked at the different conversion rates, the global conversion rate, so website visitors to donors, we saw anywhere from like 0.1% to 2.4%, depending on, the different verticals and how much traffic they get. So it's a relatively low number. And then M&R in their benchmark, they actually went a step deeper and looked at what is the main donation page conversion rate, meaning people who actually click donate. What do they do? And they found that that number was about 17% overall. So again, we like to flip these and look at it from the other perspective. That means there's 98.6 to 99.9% of website visitors are not making a donation. Now, they may do other things that may be not their intent, but there's a lot of people leaving sites without making donations. And then even those who click donate, according to M&R, 83% of those click donate and are not making a donation. So there's a lot of room for us to optimize, experiment, learn, and improve to help grow giving and unleash generosity. Now, our methodologies, we make these donations and capture the experience, and that's because we want to narrow this gap between what fundraisers see and what donors see. Right? When it comes to a donation page, we as fundraisers sometimes will think like cha-ching, like give us that money. It's a way to take in. Whereas donors don't necessarily see it that way. They see it as a way for them to contribute, to live out their values, to make a difference, to make an impact. So we see things from different perspectives, and it's useful to step into the shoes of the donor and try to understand what it's like to make these gifts. And really, we're just trying to exercise this muscle of empathy. We're huge believers that empathy is actually at the root of great online fundraising. And this is a great exercise to do. And trust me, if you make 204 donations, as our team did, you develop a real sense of empathy for donors very quick. And then we try to disseminate this information and share it with you. One thing we get asked all the time is, how do I compare? This is why these benchmark studies are so interesting. We all want to know how we do. And this is why we added a benchmarking component to last year's research study. Why in other research studies where we look at giving and emails in Canada and the US, we try to provide some benchmarks to know what are other organizations doing. And that's what this is about, specifically looking at donation pages to share what are other people doing. And then it should also help you figure out, what do you do, or what can you test, more importantly. Good experiment ideas can come from all over the place. It can come from your own data. What does your data say or suggest that you should change or try? What does Google Analytics saying? What are conversion rates saying? What can you try based on your data? Or once you start running experiments, the beautiful thing about experiments is it leads to more ideas and more experiments. You'll see these interesting things and give you more ideas to test. Or peers, what are other organizations doing well or poorly, and what can you do? Academia, I think, is really interesting to see what they're doing in like high level behavioral type research. And then, how do we boil that down and actually use it in the day to day? I think that's what a lot of what we do in our testing lab. And then association, it's one of the core ingredients of innovation, where that we take ideas from kind of unrelated sectors or spaces, real estate, sports, whatever it might be, and try to apply those to our space, nonprofit. It's one way that we can really test things and innovate. But this study in particular is really about, what are peers doing? So I'm going to use a lot of examples, good and bad, from organizations that were in the study. So hopefully you can see what others are doing, and gives you a bunch of ideas to think about how to do things differently or test. So to just kind of tee up the study a little bit, we became a donor and tracked the giving experience. There's 204 organizations in here across 12 verticals. And then we captured how much their revenue was and how much they spent on fundraising to try to do another level of analysis. We made these donations over the course of a week at the end of February and early March, and made $20 donations. So key to know, it wasn't year end, it wasn't summer. It's kind of like early spring, late winter, I guess depends where you live. And it was $20. And then we tried to answer as objectively as we can, yes, no, or binary questions, 27 different related to the giving and 5 questions related to the thank you confirmation page. And then we scored this using the same methodology, slightly tweaked, that we've used in the past for other studies like the Canadian and the American Online Fundraising Scorecard. So that's kind of our methodology in a quick nutshell. And that's what we did. So when we look at who's in the study, again, we wanted to get this kind of swath from across the industry, 12 verticals. We were hoping to get at least 10. You can see there was only one vertical where we had less than 10, and that's because we weren't actually able to make donations to a few of those organizations, which is an insight in its own. And then according to size too, you can see there were some small organizations and some mega organizations, but the vast majority are kind of in that 10 to 500 million. I realize that's a large range, but the kind of mid to large is more of the organizations that were in these studies. So just kind of sharing stats and information isn't the most useful. So here's just like the high level stuff, and then we're going to get more into the tactical. But the median score across all organizations was 57%. If you have been in high school or college, you know that that's not a great score. So again, we all have room to improve across verticals. Some verticals more than others. There's one outlier in arts and culture. Public society benefit is also down, and then there's a few good ones. But everyone can improve. If the median's 57 and the best vertical is just over 60, it means we all have room to improve. And then looking by size, it does seem like smaller organizations do have a lot more areas to improve in compared to the large. But once you become a large organization, it doesn't really matter if you're medium to large to mega to huge or whatever the designation is. Just by spending more money, and we actually looked at how much are they spending on fundraising, and does that correlate to the overall score? And we found no correlation. The more money you spend on fundraising doesn't really make a difference. There's a point where you have to invest, but it's not like if you just keep pouring money in, your online giving experience won't necessarily improve. So that's both good news and bad news. You got to spend some money, but everyone can optimize and improve. So that's the high level on the study. Just a couple key things to keep in mind here that will make sense as we talk about how to improve your donation pages. And the first is this: there's a massive difference between giving and buying. That may seem like an obvious statement, like duh, no duh, Brady, but there is a big difference. And so we can learn from for-profits, but we need to understand the difference of a donor journey. And we talk about a spark line of a donation. So this is kind of what happens in this donation giving process or donation making process, where we all start at the status quo. No one wakes up in the morning and says, I'm just going to give some money away today. Doesn't that sound good? No one really says that. So we all start at the status quo. Our job as fundraisers, marketers, to move people interest, involvement, investment. And that often starts with some form of interrupter. This could be an ad, it could be a billboard, it could be an email, something that kind of makes people stand up and take notice to actually engage with the idea of giving. So that moves them into the interest bucket. Now they're at this engagement point. This is when they're normally on your donation page, on your landing page, on your website. So now they're trying to figure out, do I really want to do this? How involved do I want to be? And at some point in that reading and assessing the copy and the text and the visual, they're making this decision. They've arrived at this moment of decision. Do I want to give or do I not? Now there's a lot of little decisions that lead there, but fundamentally now they choose yes or no. As we've just seen, more often than not, people say no, and then they go back to the status quo. But for that chunk of people that do say yes, here is the big difference between giving and buying. Here's the emotional climax, the kind of reward, the feeling that you get, the endorphin rush actually happens before you complete your donation. You just feel good about the idea of giving. That's the emotional climax. Whereas when we buy stuff, you pay money, the pain first, and then you get the reward. Or more often we buy stuff online and 2 days later it comes in the mail from Amazon. So this is the big difference, the emotional climax. Now, the better we communicate the emotional climax or the reason to give, the longer our conversion horizon is, or the more kind of motivated or interested someone will be in making a donation. Because at some point, they do have to fill out forms. They do experience pain or friction. They have to give their credit card. They have to fill this out. And at some point, if there's just so much friction in the donation process, they will abandon that process and they will not complete their donation. So when you look at this, when we think about a marketing funnel, this doesn't really look like a funnel. So the analogy we use and that I love is a donor mountain. I learned this before I came to work here at NextAfter, and it was one of the most useful concepts for me to reorient how I think about online fundraising, and that it's a journey going up where gravity is working against us and our donors at the bottom. And the goal is a macro decision, in this case, yes, donation, but each step, email to landing page to donation page, there's all these little decisions that donors are making. And subconsciously or consciously, they're valuing, is there value in what I'm doing versus the cost? And the more that we can use our main tool, a message to communicate value, we can get them to say yes. But if at any point it feels like, man, I don't know what my donation is doing, or man, this seems unclear, if there's more fields than they want to fill out, if there's more cost than value, they're going to say no. But the more that we can communicate value largely through our message, we can get micro yeses, which can lead to that macro yes. That's our goal. So traveling up the donor mountain. Another thing that's been so useful for me, and we're going to use as a framework to kind of teach and show these different stats, is this conversion heuristic. Now, a heuristic is just a way to think or process, or how do you articulate or identify why someone does what they do. In this case, why does someone convert or make a donation? And the simple version is there's things that add value, someone's internal motivation, their understanding of what you do, any incentive, matching, goal proximity, things like that. And then there's cost, right? Anxiety, do I trust you? And friction, what the heck do I have to do to complete my donation? And so we can kind of go through each of these areas and look at how do we identify and increase value and decrease cost. So that's the framework we're going to use. And just to highlight motivation, we're not going to touch too much on it, but this is why you need different donation pages, because different donors have different motivations at different stages. We found there's 3 main donation pages. There's an instant donation page, which is really cool. We won't talk about it today. But the 2 main ones that almost every organization uses is a general and a campaign. So the general is the one that we used in the study. It's the one that we can find from the homepage. It's the one that most people visit. The campaign page is when you're driving people there, ads and emails, and it's a slightly different strategy that you can use. So just keep that in mind when we're talking and showing these examples. These are main general donation pages. And where we are in a donor life cycle, we are a non-donor becoming a new donor. That's where this study is based. So in a real donor life cycle, then you're trying to move people to a second-year donor or a key multi-year or recurring donor. And then obviously there's lapsed donors. And then we try these reactivation strategies. And the goal is obviously to move them up into key multi-year where we know lifetime value is greater. But for this study, we're in this part of the process. We're going from a non-donor to a new donor. That's also important because there are some different strategies and techniques you should use on your donation page in different parts of the donor life cycle. So that's where we are. So hopefully that sets the stage a little bit of where we're coming from, some of the methodology, and kind of where we're making these donations as donors. So here's a few early insights. Again, this is a lot of data that we're trying to go through. So I've tried to pick out some early insights, and we're going to use this framework, but we're going to actually go from back to front. This is actually one of the techniques that we use to optimize pages. It's often easier to start with anxiety and friction, incentive, value proposition, and then motivation is really difficult to assess sometimes. So we're going to go from back to front. And this is what you can do as well when you look at your donation page, is how do you optimize your page? You can kind of start at the back of this equation and work your way over. And so we're not going to talk about incentives and motivation, but today it'll be in the report, but this is where we're going. So let's start with the anxiety part. The question that donors are asking is really, why should I trust you? Trust is a massive part. Dr. Adrian Sargent, and it's one of the key ingredients of lifetime value is trust. And this is what people are asking. They're asking a few different questions when they're giving to build trust. One, is my information secure? This is a big deal. So it's one of the things that we looked at. So the question was, do we perceive this website to be secure in our information? We were pretty generous in how we answered that. If there was any indication that this was a secure page, we gave people a yes. So there's only, 6% of organizations where it wasn't secure, which is not great, but any kind of security indication, HTTPS, a lockbox, a security seal, something that made us feel secure. But security and trust isn't just binary yes, no. There's things that we can do to actually influence it. And one that we've found is something like this. So here's a real experiment from our research lab. You can find it if you want. We've got over 1,600 of these different ones now. But you can see the main difference here is where the credit card information goes in. It's darker shade, and that little icon is trying to represent that, hey, this information is secure. Just by adding that design treatment, helped increase donations, in this case, almost 10%. Something that we've seen in other experiments. Just adding this little treatment can help increase the fact that people believe their information is secure where it matters most, their credit card information. The irony is these 2 pages are the same page, same levels of security. All that they did here is just say, this is secure, and here's how you know, with this little icon and a small increase in donations. So here's a few examples that we saw. So slightly different treatment here, right? Submit donation, and they have that little lockbox right on the button. So it communicates confidence and trust. Or something like this. You can see here they have all transactions are secure and encrypted, and they also use a lockbox right where the credit card number goes in. So kind of different ways to treatment to apply this concept. But the key concept and something for you to try is, can you show donors that their credit card information is secure when it matters most, when they're filling it in? So that's one way to build trust and security. Another question they may be asking is, am I making a good decision? You know, at this point, they've kind of made their decision. They've chosen to donate. But as we saw in that donor mountain, it's not just one decision. Yes, I want to donate or not. They're making all these micro decisions all the way throughout. So even at the last stage, we have an opportunity to influence this factor. Are they making a good decision? And one way to do that is use third-party endorsements or evidentials or trust marks. And it's something that less than half of organizations, only 42% of organizations, are using these. Now, there was an interesting study done by the folks at Donor Voice in partnership with the DMA Nonprofit Federation, where they wanted to see what is the value or impact of these trust marks, if any. And what they found is that pretty much any trust mark has more value to donors than no trust mark. So you can see Charity Navigator was the highest, and Guide Star, DMA certified, and then a quote, compared to that last one, which was nothing. So some trust mark outperforms nothing according to them. And what's funny is this DMA certified one isn't even a real designation. Like, that doesn't exist at all. They just made that up as part of this experiment. So even if something isn't known or recognized, if it just kind of looks like it's trustworthy, then people are more likely to trust it. So I'm not advocating to create your own trust mark, but hopefully you have Charity Navigator or Guide Star. But even if it's a lesser known association or some accreditation, or you might have something and it's worth trying out, some trust mark, is it better than no trust mark? But the key thing is, you can't just slap a trust mark on there anywhere. It's similar to the security. It matters where you place it. This is the Wilderness Society. It's one of my favorite designed pages in terms of how crisp and clean it is. But at the bottom, you can see how they use the trust mark. Right below that Donate Now button, when you're about to complete, they just have your gift is tax deductible and 2 trust marks. So it just helps you feel extra safe and secure right at the very end that you're making a good decision. A few other examples, you can see it here, very similar, right? Trust marks underneath the donate button. Or this example, Nature Conservancy. You can see right in the top, they have "You Can Trust Us" with a couple seals, one security, one trust mark. And then they actually have more trust seals at the bottom, more close to where you complete your donation. So again, they want to state it clearly and make sure it's in context. So maybe that's something you can try if you have trust marks, but make sure it's in context and within the eyesight of the donor. And then one of my other favorite things, this isn't really a trust mark, but it's related to the last moment of donation. On the left here, you can see an experiment where under the donate button, they actually just use 2 sentences to kind of confirm the value proposition or the message or reinforce why you're making a good decision, and saw a 31% increase in donations just by having 2 sentences below the donate button. So again, we have the ability to influence and build trust throughout the whole donation process, even at the very, 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 very end. Not a lot of organizations do it. We didn't see this very much at all. Probably less than 10%. It's not something we captured, so that's anecdotal feedback, but it's something that's worth trying. Can you reinforce this message at the very end with some copy maybe under that button? So here's a quick little checklist if you want to take notes, or if you haven't, and again, you can get this later, but how do you reduce anxiety? Make sure your page is secure. I mean, hopefully it is. Most pages were. One way to also build trust, can you keep it on your own domain and URL, even if it's a subdomain, instead of linking off to a third party? That can kind of erode trust or make people get more confused. And if it is secure, make sure they know where it matters, that credit card area. Link to privacy policy can help. Again, maybe try using those third-party evidentials or trust marks. And can you reinforce the message below the donate button? So those are some ways that organizations we're seeing are addressing anxiety and kind of why it's important. So now we're going to move on to the friction side of things. So again, looking at that spark line of a donation, friction here is what can lead to abandonment. The more friction you have, the more likely someone is to actually abandon. So I love talking about friction because I think it's one of the easiest ways to improve the giving experience and see results. But it also reminds me of my grandfather. And this is my grandfather, Albert, as you can tell by his Canadian Tire hat. I'm pretty sure that's copyright infringement, but that's fine. This makes me think of my grandfather because he was a pastor and a church planter for his whole life. And so he didn't swear, but friction was his F word. So if we were, golfing or watching his Toronto Maple Leafs and something went bad, he'd say, "Oh, friction." All the time. So I can't not think about friction and think about my grandfather. And if you want to know more about my grandfather, this is his favorite mug. You can always tell the Swede, but you can't tell him much. My dad now has that mug since my grandfather's passed. And so hopefully one day I'll be rocking this mug myself. Anyways, back to friction. There's 7 different types of donation page friction that we've kind of clustered them into. So you can kind of, again, use this as a checklist and areas to look at. So specifically, when we were capturing data, we looked at these 4. Some of them are hard to capture data, so we didn't have it. I'll go through all 7, but just wanted to let you know we actually have data on some of these, but not all. So number 1, field number friction. So here's a real experiment. The main difference you might be able to see on the right is the cell phone field in this case was required. By adding the cell phone field and making it required, they saw a decrease in revenue of 50%. Now, we have seen if the cell phone is optional, no difference in conversion rate. But the key concept here is the more fields that you add and require, the more likely, again, someone is to abandon their donation, especially out of context. So we looked at how many non-essential fields were organizations requiring. Again, requiring is key. And we found 40% of organizations required non-essential information. So this was things like the phone number. Again, we've talked about that was the biggest one that people required. So if you're going to require it, you better make dang sure you can make up the benefit through other strategies or communicate why do you want the phone in the first place. Because donors fear or have anxiety about, are you going to spam them? Are you going to text them? Are you going to call them every night? So phone, does it have to be required? A title seems like an unnecessary requirement. You know, someone like me, I'm getting older, but I still don't go by Mr. And then you're also making people to choose kind of with their designation. Maybe they had someone recently pass, maybe they're not married and it's painful. It just doesn't necessarily seem crucial to make required. And how do you use that in a beneficial way? A CAPTCHA is trying to get at security, which is good, but it's a very cumbersome way to actually confirm security. There's some other ways with hidden fields and using some JavaScript, and increasingly forms are getting better at not using CAPTCHA. Just about 10 organizations required what inspired your gift today, or how did you hear about us? It's not necessarily that's a bad question to ask, but to require it is tough. And also to ask during the donation flow isn't great. We'll show some examples, especially on the thank you page, but that's really where that question should go, is after a donation. You don't want to stop someone in the middle of their donation to think about that. And then designation. There weren't many, but some required designation without pre-selecting one. We'll talk about decision friction in a bit, but if you're going to require or have designation, you should make it easy and at least suggest one. So those were some of the areas that people were making required. So one example here on the left, you can see, we'll talk about layout in a second, but you can see the form there. It's not a great layout going left to right. It doesn't look good on the eye. It's kind of hard to read the gray on gray, but they have a CAPTCHA here under payment. That's even before you put in personal details. They require date of birth. Not everyone would be maybe willing to give you their date of birth and tell you how old they are. But it's also, you don't know how or why you need to give the date of birth. I'm assuming they will send me a card or maybe ask me to do a birthday fundraiser, but like, why do you want my date of birth? And maybe I'm more likely to give it to you. And then there's that, how did you hear about us required right now? Again, can you collect that at another time or another place? So compare that to maybe something like this, where just visually it looks better, of course, but the amount of information that's required, it's all that you need to process a gift and nothing more. So the key thing here is limit the amount of required fields and information to process a gift. So we talked a little bit about field layout, and here's an experiment about how valuable or important that actually is. So on the left, you can see the form fields going down, and on the right, it's actually the exact same amount of forms, the same form fields. They're just laid out using some horizontal space. And just by laying it out differently, it looks more easy, and it's even clustered. So when you fill it out, first name, last name, and your address and payment details, the way that that flows even makes sense. And that helped increase donations almost 40% in this case. Same information, just laid out differently. And you can just feel it, especially again, when you make all these donations, you feel it. So something like this on the left versus something like this is actually a raised donors form on the right. You can see how kind of nice and spaced it is, and using the cluster effect. Like, look at all this kind of wasted space that lengthens the page that isn't really necessary, versus on the right here, just nice and clean going across and down linearly. It's easier on the eye and easier to fill out, and it can help increase conversion. So are you using this horizontal space on your forms for better spacing and less of a digital footprint? Form error friction. This isn't one that we captured. We did capture it in the Canadian study, but not in this one. But here's what I mean by form error friction. This is another raised donors form. So as you're going out, filling out the name, so Brady Josephson, an email, I put in an invalid email. And before I move on, it actually tells me, oh, hey, that's not a valid email. Please correct your email. This is a good form of error validation. What often happens is that you'll go through and then you have to actually go all the way down and click next or donate. And then it reloads and then it says, oh, you missed something or that's a mistake. And that's very, very frustrating. So this is one way to solve that problem with kind of flagging the error right away. But even having like asterisks next to what is required, or we saw one example that was just very clear, required. It's actually useful for the donor so they know this is essential information that I must fill out without going through the frustration of reloading the page and not knowing what's wrong. So how can you limit the error friction? Can you show them that they missed a field or it's incorrect before they actually move on, and definitely before they click submit and have to refresh? That's error friction in a way that we can avoid it. Confusion friction has a few different elements to it, but one of the easiest ways to think about it, or one of the easiest elements, is just navigation and distraction links. They can be kind of confusing. It may seem crazy to you or me that this navigation would really distract people once they're on a donation page, but maybe you're here and you see policies impacting you, like, I'm interested in that, or what are events, or what's this donate button, even though it brings you back down. So at this stage, they've clicked donate, they have expressed interest. Don't give them any reasons to click or leave that page. Just by removing that here, they helped increase donations 195%. It's one of the easiest ways to improve the user experience. Just remove these distracting links. So we looked at that in the study and found that 55% of organizations had these unnecessary and distracting links. We also looked at, were there multiple calls to action, sign up for newsletter, kind of other ways to give, basically other things that weren't just available, but actually kind of actively asking you to do. And almost 40% of organizations had multiple calls to action. This can be confusing. You click donate and then there's these other things for you to do. How do you streamline it? By limiting the amount of things that they have to click and calls to action. So a few examples, we've got kind of a not great one on the left and a good one on the right. You can see right away up top, program services, you've got this navigation stuff versus just get rid of it. You don't necessarily need it. And then throughout the page, you also have some later on, right? So all these other donation options, you've got all these other links, find food, get involved, social media, versus on the other side, none of that. It's a lot more easy, clear, and not distracting to go through and complete your donation. You can also see the trust marks here. See how they're buried all the way at the bottom? You can't really see them, versus these that are a little bit more in view. Again, if you're using trust marks, make sure that they're visible. Otherwise, you won't really experience a lot of that benefit in the donation page. But the key point here is, can you remove any and all of those distracting links and conflicting calls to action? Decision friction. So here's an example, an experiment from a really large, well-known child sponsorship organization. And so here's what they were doing from their homepage. They're asking, what is your birthday? But the reason why they were doing that was to better match you up with a potential child to sponsor. So then they would show you kids who share your birthday or were very close to your birthday. Cool idea, right? Increases resonance, helps prioritize which child to sponsor. But there was still like equally weighted rows of 3 cute kids. And so in the treatment, this is what they did. Let's just prioritize one child. They added in some design treatment to kind of further accentuate the congruency of the birthday design. But they prioritized one child. And then below that, there was still the rows of 3 for people to choose. And just by prioritizing one child, they saw a 14.4% increase in donations or conversion rate. And that's a big deal for this large organization from their homepage, right? Who know what they're doing. But just by limiting the decision and prioritizing one, or making it easier for them to do that, helped decrease the decision friction, increase the chance of someone making a donation. And so what we do, we actually ask our donors sometimes to make a lot of decisions, and often without context. So here's an example of a public media organization. So you click donate, and then you come here. Now there's a lot of things for you to do. Do you want to support TV, radio? Then you've got all these options, matching gifts and mutual funds and vehicles and major gifts. So already it's a little overwhelming and you have to make some decisions. And so maybe you should donate to the TV station because it's top left. That's what they kind of want you to do, or what we wanted to do in this study. But you can see how there's already decisions and there's not a lot of information for us to make that decision. So then if you click donate and then you go to the TV side of things, then you end up at this page. And what do you see? More decisions. Now they've at least tried to feature some gifts, but you've got different price points, you've got different benefits, you've got different mugs, different ways to give. There is a huge cognitive load or a huge stress on the brain to make decisions just to complete a donation. This isn't to say we should remove all decisions. Sometimes they have to choose amounts and one-time and recurring. But how can this process, do you think, be improved to limit the amount of decisions? Or can we suggest decisions or make it easier or collect stuff later? Can you reduce the decisions donors need to make and clearly prioritize one for them? If you have to require funds or have some premiums or something like that, can you kind of pre-select one or make it easier for them to go through the flow? Because the vast majority of donors don't really know a lot about your funds and perks. They just want to support you in the cause. So make it easier for them. That's decision friction. Then there's device friction. This is increasingly important. When we look at other trends across the board, Blackbaud's charitable giving report, you see this trend line of mobile giving continuing to grow up to 24% in their latest one, or something like M&R looking at mobile. You can see it's grown 20% and 23%, and in their benchmark, 30% of transactions and 21% of revenue are now coming in mobile. So it is and will be increasingly crucial to optimize the giving experience. So some good news, only 6% of nonprofit donation pages weren't optimized for mobile, so that's good. Again, though, we were pretty generous by optimize. Basically, if it wasn't absolutely terrible and tried to optimize for mobile, we gave them a pass. But like, here's an example of a not very optimized mobile giving experience. So here's desktop and what it looks like. You basically, absolute bare minimum on optimization is mobile optimization. Remove the pinch and scroll. So it's something more like this, donation page, and then it automatically responds to your device, so it's more clean. It sounds very simple and basic, but again, a lot of organizations aren't doing this and aren't doing it well. Because the other thing that we've seen is it actually has a huge benefit to the bottom line, right? So this experiment was looking at donation design and layouts. On the left is kind of the old donation page, and on the right is the new one. And there was an 18% increase in donations. But the big thing is, here's the difference in mobile. The other one was not optimized versus this is what their mobile experience looked like. You can see it has the reasons to give, and then that form and the credit card shading treatment is still there and available. So when you actually dig into this experiment, they found that there was a 64% increase in conversion on mobile devices. And that's where 64% of the traffic was coming to that page. So that 18% increase was largely driven by the much improved and optimized mobile giving experience. One thing to make sure you don't do is don't cut out the value proposition. We'll talk more about the messaging and copy in a second, but 14% of nonprofits we found removed their value proposition on their mobile version. So here's one very clear example. So on the left, you have the desktop version. On the right, you have the mobile. It should be pretty clear and obvious, the difference, but if we actually zoom in, you can see what is missing: the image and all that copy and the testimonial. And what is that? That's the reason to give. So that's cut out of the mobile giving experience. And maybe it's under the guise of, efficiency or limiting friction, but you're really cutting out the reason to give. And so if this was an experiment, what we would often see is a decrease for the mobile version on the right without the copy. So test your giving process, make sure it's functional on mobile, and make sure you can still see the value proposition. Those are two really important things to do when it comes to mobile giving. All right, so that's how to reduce friction. And then the last one, is steps friction. This is a very clear experiment. On the left, you have what I call an "Are you sure you want to give" page, which says, here's what you're about to do. And then it's one extra step before you get the confirmation page. And in this case, they said, do we really need that page? What if we just cut it out completely? And just by removing this page, they saw 176% increase in donations. Now, there's a few things like that page on the left is kind of confusing. It feels like you're done your donation, but it's not. It's not very well designed, the kind of gray. But the key principle here is the more steps you add, similar to the more fields you add, the more likely it is that someone's going to abandon their donation process. So we looked at how many steps. And there's kind of good news, bad news. 70% of organizations were 1 or 2 steps, so that's good. But once you get beyond 3 steps or more, you're running that risk. You're in the red zone. And 30% of organizations were still having 3 or more steps. Now, what's tough for us when we do the research is we need to be objective and binary, how many steps, but there is a difference between steps. So for example, charity water, what kind of instructor would I be if I didn't use a charity water example, right? So here's the donation page. And if you click donate, then you have name, email, number, step 1, and then step 2 is your address and information. So this is technically 3 steps, 1, 2, 3. But when you go through the flow, it feels very simple, very seamless, not a lot of friction. So technically that's 3 steps, but they do it really well. So that's where even the step number, there's some, kind of gray area. But the key thing that you want to avoid is maybe something like this. So donate, tons of decisions to make, but after you make your decision, input your information, input your amount, then confirm what you already have said you want to do. There's some error friction in there, there's layout friction, and then you actually go out to a different website or different URL with a slightly different design to reconfirm and fill in all your information. So this is what you really want to avoid. 6 different steps, not congruent, filled with other friction. Key point here is just limit the number of steps in a giving sequence and be sure to remove that "are you sure you want to give" page. It's one easy way to improve and optimize the giving experience. So that's kind of reducing friction. Hopefully that's a handy checklist for you that you can go through. Now we want to talk about this value proposition. I've mentioned it a few times, but it is one of the main drivers of revenue. So again, if we look back to the spark line of a donation, why would someone make a gift and how strong is that emotional climax? That's your value proposition. That's your message. And the better you do that, the longer your conversion horizon is, which means people will, in theory, be willing to put up with a bit more friction, or maybe they'll be more inspired to give or give more. And again, when we look at the donor mountain, it's that message piece. This is your value proposition. And the question that you need to answer throughout the giving process, but also on the donation page, is this: if I'm your ideal donor, why should I give to you rather than some other organization, or not at all? They don't have to give, or not at all is a key part of that equation. There's really 4 main ways that you can answer it. First, do they want it? This is appealing. What is appealing about this donation? Why should I make it? Can they get it anywhere else? This is exclusivity. Why are you so different than the organization down the street? Do they understand it? This is clarity. What will my donation do? How do I know it makes a difference? Do they believe in you? That's credibility. That's part of that trust mark thing that we've already talked about. So there's appeal, exclusivity, clarity, and credibility. And that's what we were kind of looking for when we said, how are organizations doing? So here's what we found. Keynote, this is subjective. I mean, we do this a lot, so we're pretty good at being objective while being subjective. But we just kind of said, is it strong, average, or weak? Or yes, kind of, no. And 33% of organizations had a strong value proposition. Here's one example that was good, right? America's wild animals are counting on you. What does my donation support? America's wild animals. Counting, there's pressure, and you, this is for me. So really good headline start. Then it goes into a fight against kind of the current administration, right? Giving people something to fight for and a reason to give is hugely important. So they talk about that. They talk about defending wildlife and endangered and imperiled species. And then they also reference kind of, hey, maybe you should become a recurring donor for just $9 a month. So they're even including some of that message. But, the best value proposition in the world, I don't know, but it's clearly strong. It make you understand what your donation is doing. Family life takes a little bit longer approach, but you can see things like 41 years, 21,000 people, 57,000. These are trust and credibility builders. But then they also go, but we also know there are still so many more families that need help. There's the role for the donor. Right? You can see in the headline, you can help. So there's a role for the donor to play. There's a need for something. They even have a little fight about, where values right now. So again, something to fight for, a reason to give before reconfirming the impact, and then make your gift below. So those are some like stronger examples. And then we saw some kind of weaker examples. So I will only just do a couple quick. And again, not a huge amount of judgment. We can all get better. This one, be the difference. Is that exclusive? Is it clear? Do you know what's going on? And then if you actually read this copy, it's all about starting a fundraiser or giving through Amazon Smile, but I'm on the donation page. So that's confusing. It's distracting. And actually there's nothing in there other than you can make an incredible impact at-risk youth. It's fairly generic. Other than that, the rest is about how to give, not why I should give. So they're using copy, but maybe not very important. Or we saw a lot of this. Why should I give to this organization as opposed to another one, or not at all? It's very hard to answer that question without using words. We have to use words. And we've seen this in experiment after experiment. One line in social media versus kind of, 4 paragraphs explaining and trying to answer that question. 150% increase in giving. Just this 2 sentences to help explain why a donation is needed. 28% increase in giving. Now you might be saying, or maybe you've heard this, people don't like to read, says your board member. Well, maybe use some of these experiments. This is an extreme example. These donors really like to read. So they gave them a lot to read on their donation page. Increase in conversion rate. Well, what if we just give them the shortcut button and they can skip by all that reading that they don't want to do and just give? Well, decrease in donations, because that's what they came to do. They want to know why their gift is making a difference. Well, what if we just put a video instead of text? Well, you might be missing out on a lot of donations. Videos are slow. You can't scan them. You have to look at people that maybe you don't want to look at. No judgment on that particular fellow, but donations can slow you down. Copy is important. It's hugely important. So we looked specifically, how are they using copy? 29% of nonprofits had less than a sentence. That's this example that I showed you earlier with nothing on there at all. 30% of organizations have nothing on their page at all. So we kind of looked, well, how many are using less than 4 sentences? So this is where the majority of organizations are using some, but not a ton. So here's an example of that. So you can see this kind of 1 sentence that gets a little bit at that value proposition, but it's still really hard to decipher why you should give with just that limited amount of copy. And only 39% of nonprofits used more than 4 sentences. So that's where we saw some examples like this. We'll talk about it a little bit later, break it down. But you can see, provide a meal for hope and the hungry. You know what your donation's doing. Hot meals, safe shelter, and then they have some trust. Using some copy, you know what your donation's doing. This one, it's not super long, but you can kind of get at their nonprofit, healthy internet for all, keep web open and free. Starts getting at it, something like this. Act now, save the birds, habitats. You can start understanding a little bit better what your donation should be doing. So is longer always better? No, it obviously depends on the context and how you use it. This is a key example for a few reasons. One is the length. You can see one is shorter than the other, but there are also different forms of copy. One is your gift, summary, bullet, what your donation will do, and then use the gift below. The other one's a lot more narrative format. What we found here in the longer, more narrative format, decreased giving 30%, right? When you visit a donation page, again, the main general donation page, I don't really want to tell others. I want to make my gift. So make your gift. When you do, here's why you should support us. Use your gift form below. That's actually kind of the template that we've found works. And it's actually in our donation page template. Headline, subheadline, copy, bullet, reconfirm. Versus the longer, more narrative format, which is maybe more suited to a campaign page where you're working harder and you can kind of communicate from an email into a donation page or something like that. So the key point here is you want something that gives people enough to answer that question, hopefully tapping into some of this, but you don't need to expand and go nuts and use long form narrative. And the easiest thing for us to do, I think, is just be clear. So again, when we look at these examples, again, provide a meal for and hope for hungry homeless people. Pretty clear. Then they start talking about Miami, hot meals, safe shelter. It's pretty clear what my donation will do. In this other case, right? Give birds a fighting chance, protect the places they need. You're starting to understand, stand up for healthy internet for all, keep the web open and free. So how can you not just use more copy, which yes, you need to do, but how can you make it more clear and explain why their donation is needed and what their donation will do? Key point here as well, maybe you saw this, their donation, their donation. This is another thing we see all the time where it's us focused language. Here's an experiment that proves it. On the left, very organizational centric, our mission, organization versus a couple, what you do versus all this, you, your, you. Of course, you mentioned the organization a couple times, but it's so clear that this one is really, look how awesome we are, give us your money versus you can make a difference and give today. And we see it in the experiment result, 22.9% increase. And we see this even with good examples. So if we look at those good examples again, look at, this is kind of that collective we, which can kind of go either way, but some of this is we must act now, we can fight back, we can protect birds. Well, what do? I want to protect birds. I want to give a generous gift to power protection. We can't help but take ourselves, we can't remove ourselves from the equation like this. We are proudly nonprofit. Is that really what you want to lead with? What can I do? So you can help us, you can give, but like, I want to power an open and free internet. So we rely on donations. Our mission to keep your gift keeps the web open and free. Just tweak it slightly and it's much more powerful and about me. We are all guilty. We see this all the time. So again, one of the easiest things is, can you turn this we, us, our language into you, your language? It can help clearly communicate the difference that they can do. So that's kind of the value proposition side of things. You can see what some organizations are doing, but this is absolutely crucial to improving average gift and conversion rate. We also looked at what happens after I give. I won't spend as much time on this. Most people had a confirmation page, 95%, so that's good. 97% thanked their donor, which is great. So some used a pop-up instead of an actual confirmation page. So thanking donors is the bare minimum, and we're doing pretty much perfect in that category. But then there wasn't a lot for us to do sometimes. Some people didn't denote the amount of the gifts. Almost half didn't continue on the value proposition, just says, thank you, you're a partner, but like, you can reinforce, what did my donation do, or what will it do? Make me feel extra good about that thing that I just did. And some that did have some calls to action felt a little cold, right? So this one, you make a gift and then it's make a one-time donation, other ways to give, before you get the thank you, and then you get into an employer match. The sequence of things is really important, right? I just made a gift. You should thank them and honor me, and before asking me to do something else. So maybe something more like this, gift complete, maybe not the best, warmest language, but if you get into the copy, thank you for your generosity and partnership. Here's what we'll do. What happens next? You will receive a receipt. You want to multiply the gift? Here's an easy tool to look for matching. Let us know how your giving experience was. This is a good place to put that feedback. Then you can share and have some other questions. So this is not only like a warmer feeling page, but it also is more logical to move me to a next step, of which we didn't see a lot. So again, I won't spend time diving into all this. The report will, but one thing we saw a notable increase in from last year's studies to this year's studies is more people using employer match tools. So whether it's searching directly on the page, like on the left, where you can kind of has a drop down, or on the right where it has that employer will match. That's the main call to action on their confirmation page. And then it'll take you to another page or another site. More organizations, I think it was about 35, 36 were using this, which is about twice as high as we've seen in the past. So more organizations are doing this. Maybe that's something you can use or try. And something that we're still not seeing a ton of is kind of an immediate upgrade or a give again. Now, this may be counterintuitive because they just gave, but it is something we've seen some success with. So in this experiment on the left, the option was turn into a recurring donor or immediately upgrade versus make an additional one-time gift to a different part of the organization, a different fund. What they saw was a 5% conversion rate immediately to recurring donors right after they made a one-time gift. It may be more surprising, almost a 29% increase in conversion rate to make a second one-time gift. So that's a 493% difference in conversion rate, but obviously big difference in average gift. Recurring donors are worth a lot more, so you're taking a lot less on the average gift, but you're getting so many more donors. In this case, it led to, this is a 12-month projection, 42% more revenue by asking for a one-time gift. So whether you ask for an immediate upgrade or a second one-time gift, you can kind of play with the numbers and see, but this could be an opportunity to move someone to a second gift and kind of move up that donor life cycle even quicker. And it's counterintuitive, but there's this thing called cognitive momentum where we have motivations, and once we're in motion and in action, we're more likely to stay in action. So I showed you an example earlier that's maybe a little cold, but here's a bit warmer, better example moving to a monthly donor ask. So this is that Wilderness Society again. So big thank you. Talk to me by my name. In this case, I was Vanessa. Thank you for making a gift. Say that again, make sure that they know that. Then they move into their value proposition, fighting every day, become a monthly donor. I can click that button and go on to make my donation right away. So you can see how it's not like they're taking advantage of me. They're basically saying, thank you, you're awesome. You know how you can actually join the fight and do even more? Here's how. It kind of makes sense in the context of the conversation. There's still a lot of we, us, our, and ideally the button would maybe be a form, so it's not an additional step, but they're doing some good things there. A few other examples we saw from organizations trying this, donate now with one click. Kind of interesting. So they've saved the information so you can just kind of redonate with one click, or a different version of this just by kind of clicking this button, you can convert into a monthly gift. So again, limiting the friction for people. But the key thing here again, value proposition and messaging, value proposition and messaging. And above that, thank you. You have to thank people and honor and respect them. then you have to communicate the value of what it is that you're asking them to do and then make it easy for them to do. So that's a little bit of a checklist there. Thank the donor, reinforce the impact, and then in context, after they've been thanked, you can suggest a next action. So we're kind of running out of time. I just want to highlight a few kind of other interesting things in the study that you can get when it's done and downloaded. Some things that we looked at, like what language did they use in the headline? Almost a quarter of organizations used donate. Some used thank you. Some talked about the impact. Some had no headline. Was it in an image or not? We've seen banner blindness, where text in images or in banner images often doesn't get read. And if the headline's crucial, maybe it shouldn't be in there. So a quarter of organizations are doing that. This is untested, but something that we wanted to look at is sentiment analysis. So we took all the copy and uploaded it into a tool that would kind of come back with what is the main emotional sentiment and how strong was it. And you can see those different kind of categories and how many organizations fell into that bucket. And then we tried to overlay the strength of the value proposition in relation to that to try to see, is there something in here that's kind of interesting? And, you know, for me, there wasn't very much, but hate and anger actually had a very strong value proposition, right? Something to fight for, fight against. It's a big reason to give. Not that we should be fueling hate and anger, but evoking emotion is a key concept. This also stuck out to me. Worry and love, they were the most used and had the highest score. And worry and love kind of correlate to distress and empathy, two emotions that have been proven to kind of be crucial to storytelling that leads to action. Distress calls us in and kind of calls us to battle, and we have to pay attention. And then empathy and love, we have to feel something emotionally. So it's interesting to see how the sentiment analysis kind of wraps into some other things that we've seen. And again, some sentiment is better than no sentiment, just like some copy is generally better than no copy. Again, we looked at things like incentives. 36% used incentives. 10 organizations used match. We saw a few organizations, more organizations trying to use it to incentivize monthly giving. That's a trend that we're seeing kind of as we look year to year. Matching does work. I know we get asked all the time. Here's an experiment. 3 emails that don't talk about the match. 3 emails in a campaign that highlight the match. Almost an 88% increase in conversion rate highlighting the match. So, you know, if you're not using matches, maybe that's something you can do, or can you use that to inspire monthly or recurring giving? You know, and we talked about how important clarity is. One way you can do that is kind of using a quantifiable impact anchor. So something like this, where in this experiment, tribute, do you appreciate staying connected? Do you appreciate staying connected? Small increase versus these options where they did a $30 donation does, a $30 donation does, and saw pretty large increases in conversion rate. It's quantifying the impact that my little $30 donation can make. And it means a lot to $30 smaller level donors. So we saw a few examples like this. You can see $50, $125, $250, just kind of adds a little bit of clarity to what someone's donation will do, or something like this. This is like a slider, which was kind of cool. You know, you want to give 25 or more, and then it goes up or down of how many families you can help. So these are just kind of another, you know, simple-ish ways to communicate clearly the impact of a gift. We saw that used a few times. We did look at recurring. I mean, we did a huge study on recurring last year, so I won't go too much into it. But again, the vast majority of organizations are using a very simple call to action like this, you know, make this gift recurring. Very few, 7%, had a value proposition of why you should become a monthly donor. So there wasn't a lot, but some small examples like this on the left. You can see this little subtle nudge. Your steady support prepares us for every challenge. Let's plan for the future. Just kind of hinting, maybe you want to do this, versus something like this, which is a lot more direct about here's how your monthly donation makes a big difference. And they actually default into it. So that's something on recurring. And then something I'm really interested in is the prompts. So these are kind of pop-ups that would happen during the one-time giving process to talk about monthly giving. So we actually looked at this as well. We saw 10%. What's interesting to me is recurring giving is obviously so important. Most of the time, we're doing something like this on the left. You can see make my donation recurring. In this experiment, they actually used this pop-up and said, hey, before, would you consider, goes into the value proposition, which is basically give less today and make a bigger impact over time. Saw an increase in recurring gifts and no significant impact on the likelihood of a person giving a one-time gift. Again, maybe it's counterintuitive, but it's that cognitive momentum at play. They've raised their hand. They're interested. They've selected their donation amount. They've put in their credit card information at this point, like they are committed. And so you're just saying, hey, maybe you should think about this. Here's an example from the study. Make your gift monthly. Basically, add an extra 1,000 meals. This is a human service organization. Uh, Add an extra 1,000 meals will be provided thanks to a generous partner. So they're using this kind of incentive. Monthly giving is efficient and effective. Will you change your gift to $9 a month instead? It's a pretty strong value proposition. It's easy to just say, yes, process my gifts of $9 as opposed to 20, or no thanks, process my original gifts. You can kind of see how that approach can and does seem to work without negatively impacting one-time donations. So still only 10% of organizations using it, maybe a function of the type of tool you're using. It's a little advanced, but I think there's an opportunity there. Gift arrays, I know people always ask, so just a couple quick stats. There'll be more in the report, but the median first suggested amount we found was $50. 45% of organizations that had a gift array pre-selected an amount. 100 was the most common. 26% of organizations that used array buttons were radio style. 36% of organizations had 4 suggested options in the array. So 4 and then an other. And 61% used 4 or 5 options. So that's kind of generally what most organizations are doing. And 25% of organizations had a reverse array. So they went, instead of smallest to largest, they went largest to smallest. And so, some fun things with arrays. Here's an example of a reverse array where in this experiment, they actually found a decrease in conversion rate and a decrease in average gift. So test your way into a reverse array and make sure that it's actually working for you, not just in conversion rate, but average gift as well. I think that the hypothesis here is people can kind of smell the manipulation going on. Or if you're a lower level donor, you just see 250, you're like, oh, I can't give that. And then you go on your way. So be careful with the reverse array. This is an example of just those crappy radio buttons, which are extra crappy on mobile versus nice selected buttons increase. We've seen this a lot. So if you're using radio buttons, find a way to avoid that. And then even should you use an array at all? This is one of my favorite experiments. It's kind of counterintuitive, but just by removing the array, saw 126% increase in donations. We've seen this in a few other examples. And this is more in context of that donor life cycle. Once someone's given before, or maybe given a few times, that's the more optimal place to try an open field strategy. Maybe not in that non-donor to new donor where it's maybe confusing or I don't know how much to give. That's where the nudging can work. But once I'm kind of committed and understand, or if you have a higher than average online average gift, you can try an open field and just see how your donors can actually surprise you with that open field. So I want to end with this. This is a question we get asked a lot, like who should I follow or who's doing it well? A lot of people ask, and I like to look at environment organizations. The more research studies that I do, they have this great kind of combination of strong value proposition and good user experience, as well as doing some more of the innovative type things. So, they scored very well here, not the best performing vertical, but one of the highest. But then when we look at some other data sources, like the M&R benchmark, you can see that environment had 6% growth and 20% growth the last 2 years. So one of the few verticals that's seen growth in 2 years. You can see that in the chart as well. And then looking at the Giving USA study and talking to one of the lead researchers today for the podcast, shameless plug, you can see that environment's actually one of the only verticals that experienced growth this last year. And so it's not solely related to what they're doing online, but I think the environmental sector is doing something really well. So some organizations in the study that you can actually look at, you can make donations if you want, that scored highly. Sierra Club, Defenders of Wildlife, Nature Conservancy, Wilderness Society, National Audubon. Those are some you can look at. And then some other non-environmental organizations that scored well and I think are good examples to kind of look at or learn from. Family Life, Operation Smile, CARE, Americans for Prosperity, and the Innocence Project. That's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the ones that you can maybe look at. So that's kind of the quick overview. There's tons of other stuff, but there's also more resources. So I mentioned a donation page guide. We have an interactive version of it if you want to go see these different variables and check out the template and see the experiments that actually inform it. So you can kind of play around with that. And I mentioned some strategies, but if you really are like, man, how do I really optimize and improve my donation page? We actually have a full course that you can take that dives into the 3 different types and how to identify intention and motivation. And you can take that at courses.nextafter.com. I just scratched the surface on recurring, but again, we did a big study last year with salesforce.org on recurring. So you can download that and read that. It's free to do. And then all this other stuff, tools and resources and webinars, all this stuff is available at nextafter.com. So hopefully you got a bunch of ideas. You're interested and excited about the research. If you haven't asked questions, please be sure to do that now. We are going to take a little time. And while Nathan's getting queued up, I will just remind you there's only one day left to get your buy one, get one free ticket in Denver at Neo Summit. It's an awesome event. It's one of my favorite weeks and days of the year. And so hopefully you can take advantage of that and join us. So Nathan, do we have some questions?
Yes, my friend, we do. We have lots of questions. I'm sure there will be more. If you have something that's a burning question in your mind, feel free to drop it in the chat box on the right side of your screen, and we'll try our best to get to it before we wrap up here. But yes, we got a lot. So let's start at the top. I'm looking at a little document here as I'm going through these. I want to start with this one just because it's super fun, and kind of the value of attending these webinars live is that we can really do a little bit of research. And I can kind of come behind the scenes, do some research, gather some data, and then try to answer some of these questions too that maybe we wouldn't be able to ask just right or answer right off the cuff. So Rebecca asked, specifically on the Raise Donors platform, is there a way to put text below the donate button to actually add some additional value? So I sent our friend Steven over at Raise Donors an email. He responded back to me, Rebecca, he's going to get in touch with you because there is a way to do it. And as you saw in some of the experiments, it can provide some huge value. So Rebecca, Stephen will be in touch, and hopefully you can get that test up and running even before the end of the week. That'd be super cool. Some other questions.
And then share it with us.
Yes, we would love to see it, and then maybe you'll see it featured in the next webinar. That'd be super fun. Okay, so we got a lot more here. Ray asked this question, and then Tracy asked a similar one a little bit later on. They're both wondering about PayPal, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but Ray was asking, are there conversion rates that we know of for nonprofits that are using PayPal? And then Tracy was asking a similar question, like what effect do we see of using PayPal? How does that influence the donation process, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. It is something that we talk a lot about in other kind of resources and training, but we didn't talk about it today. So one big caveat, there's a big difference between using PayPal as like a merchant service provider that integrates with your form on your site, and using PayPal like a link out into PayPal land. So if you're just using it as like a merchant provider and you have the option to use PayPal, we haven't ran that experiment. Some organizations that I trust is doing good work have that as an option. What we have tested though is the like donate by PayPal, where then you click and kind of go into PayPal land. We've seen a pretty significant decrease a couple of times when you offer that. And there's a few reasons. One, we're talking about value proposition and message and the impact you can make throughout the whole donation experience. And the minute they go into PayPal land, you lose all of that control. You're at the mercy of PayPal's flow and message and things like that. There's also like, I forget my PayPal login and now I have to like reset my password and things like that. And so what we advise is you can take donations via PayPal, that's fine, but put it on like an other ways to give page, not on your donate page. So if someone really wants to give via PayPal, and there are few of those donors, they can go find it or they can contact you and then you can tell them, here's how you do it. But don't give a lot of donors that option because they might say, oh, PayPal, I've used that. They click it and now they're gone and into a different flow and a different process. So if you have to use it or want to use it, you can use it on a ways to give page, which is different than your donate now page.
Cool. Thanks, Brady. That's helpful. Here's just kind of a clarifying question that Bob asked about sort of the intent of the research. He was wondering, why did we not look at nonprofits that are under $1 million in annual revenue? Any insight into that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So two main reasons. One, there's a much greater likelihood that we aren't able to actually complete donations for those organizations, which on the research side makes it very, very difficult to get accurate vertical numbers and actually complete all the donations. Every time we can't make a donation, then that's one other organization that we have to take off the list and put them on. So we did see small organizations and arts organizations. The reason why they had scored poor and actually were under 10 was because we couldn't complete donations. They didn't have pages or they were broken. So that's a big reason. Two, the market that we generally kind of serve is larger, and that's who we're doing research kind of with and for. So we have some our own personal bias. And I also think there's a little bit more to learn from organizations in terms of what are doing well from generally large organizations. Now, those are blanket statements with huge caveats. There's amazing organizations, $1 million and less. There's terrible organizations, $100 million and more. But those are some of the reasons. And the fact that more often we experience broken forms and things like that is a pretty big reason.
Thanks, Brady. Here's another question from Cheyenne, and I pulled a little bit of research on this because we don't have a ton in our library, but there's a lot of research out there. The question is, how much friction does a CAPTCHA actually create? And looking at our own library, I think you showed this experiment. We definitely have shown it many times, but there's one time we've tested CAPTCHA where it was kind of part of a multivariate experiment. So there are a lot of things going on. And basically, when we reduced friction across the board, including removing CAPTCHA, we saw a 134% increase in donations, but it wasn't isolated. So I did a little bit of searching while you were presenting, and Moz, if you're not familiar with Moz, they're a big SEO company, lots of really great tools around online marketing, content marketing, and specifically SEO. They have a little blog talking about it, and they're basically suggesting from the research that it can lead to about a 3.2% decrease in conversion overall if you're using CAPTCHA. And then you probably saw in the chat box our very own Justin Beasley, who we refer to as our human Google, knew kind of everything that you can do to try to fix the problem. There's new versions of CAPTCHA that can kind of work behind the scenes. There's a lot of good options. So if you have specific questions about that, we can talk about some other options. There's other ways to prevent spam. It's
a good point though of talking like some of this stuff, and what can be frustrating on the nonprofit side is like, well, someone told me to use CAPTCHA, or by default our tool has CAPTCHA or something like that. And this is, where I have a lot of empathy for organizations, particularly smaller ones, and a lot of our kind of fury is actually with the vendors and providers, because they're the ones who should be testing this stuff, figuring this out, finding ways to not make donors go through all those CAPTCHA steps, but work in the background, innovate and optimize and improve so that you can spend more of your time focusing on the messaging and stewarding donors and things like that. So it is unfortunate that there's a lot of tools that I don't think do a very good job of that. And that's a big reason why we actually like Raise Donors, is they're really responsive and they do a really good job of taking on that feedback and working hard to support organizations. So
they're literally altering their roadmap so they can make it super easy to put text under your donate button right now. So
there you go.
Nice little shout out for them. Let's see, what's next? A few questions from Kirsten. We'll start with this one. And you mentioned some of this, but more of a clarifying question about the research process. As we were looking at how many steps does it take to actually complete a donation, what was counted as a step? Is that a click? Is that a page load? Is it something else?
Yeah, great question. So it's technically besides the homepage. So that's where we started. And then we would find the most obvious place to donate, which is often the donate button, which is normally in the top right. We would click that. That does not count as a step. Then we started counting steps, and it wasn't clicks. So it was either page loads, which is the most obvious thing, or in the case of some kind of modals or sliders, like the Charity Water example, we would have counted that as actually 3 steps because it was flipping. Now, if you kind of scroll down, so as you like put in your information and then you kind of kept dynamically putting the next stage of information, we wouldn't count that as a step because it's kind of continuous or congruous. So, with some sophisticated products, the difference between steps is kind of nominal. But for the most part, the steps, we try to make it not clicks, but as a donor would experience, like how many things feel like an extra step. That's what we tried as much to do. So it's not clicks, it's actual steps. So it's more page loads than clicks, but there is some nuance there.
Another question from Kirsten. You got into this a little bit later, so some of this might be clarified, but just to kind of recap, is it better to just have a gift array that has amounts on the buttons, or can you attach, well, we call it, she says, little taglines, we call them gift handles. Can you attach some of these gift handles to the buttons to say, if you give $5, it does this. If you give $25, it does this. Which option is better?
It's something to test. I think I've seen some experiments kind of go either way. And then there's obviously a caveat on how you do it. If it's really cumbersome and, not very well done, then maybe it's actually adding more friction than benefiting. But the overarching principle of quantifying impact so people more clearly understand the value of their donation is a good thing. You can do that in a few different ways. We've seen experiments where they just go like, your $50 donation today will ensure XYZ. And that's actually before the array. And then the array itself doesn't have toggleable buttons and the calculation, but you plant that seed basically of what a $30, $50 donation will do. And then it actually isn't integrated in the form. But like you saw, there are examples of like a slider where as you increase donations, it calculates how many family members, or there are examples where $25 does, and it's right on the buttons. And then if you click monthly, it'll switch over. So to say like which one is better, I don't think we have enough research or experimentation to say exactly how you do it. The key thing I think is the quantifiable impact. There's a lot of research and evidence that can help inspire giving, particularly for a non or a new donor to become a donor or better understand what their donation will do.
There's probably also a point to say that, just because you have more and more and more gift handles doesn't necessarily make it easier. You could have 10 different options, and now you're creating decision friction in the process and trying to understand what does my gift actually do. And so you probably don't want to go too far down the road, or you could risk, paralyzing someone who doesn't know, well, now how do I make this decision? So yeah, there's got to be something to test there and a balance to find. Mm-hmm. Here's a question. We talked about PayPal a little bit, but have we seen any effect from Google Pay or Apple Pay on a donation page?
Yeah, good question. So to my knowledge, there's only one experiment where we used Apple Pay, and it was inconclusive, or not inconclusive. It was insignificant. It wasn't an increase, or it wasn't a decrease. It was just kind of the same. Now that was, I think it was over a year ago now. And so as more and more people actually use Apple Pay and Google Pay, things like that, particularly on the for-profit side where you see it way, way, way more. I think the likelihood that more people will use it on the nonprofit side will increase. So one thing that will be in the study, and I didn't include it here, but we also saw on the desktop version, which is where we made our donations, which is where most people make their online donations still. We saw more like a quick donate via Stripe. There's an example of different payment providers or different tools where they'll actually kind of save your payment information via like cookies or kind of integrate with your browser, so that if you've made a donation to them in the past, or if you've even used that to make other purchases, you can kind of click that button and it'll import all that information and you can bypass importing. So I think we'll see a lot more of that. And in theory, it should be better, particularly on a mobile phone where entering your credit card information sucks. So I would expect us to do more testing in that arena in the next year or so. And I would also expect us to see more significant results. But I'd say at least the current evidence and kind of just general logic is like, why would that be a bad thing? If you have it, then you just put your thumb and it's good. And if you don't have it, then you complete your donation as normal. So if it were me, I would obviously test it, but I would be in the position of more, let's add it until we hear otherwise, as opposed to let's not do it until we hear that it works.
Yeah. And I guess I could say expect, but maybe more hope that the market shifts a little bit and that becomes much more and more commonplace. I know I find myself getting frustrated, even trying to, complete a purchase on a different, e-commerce site. I'm like, I just want to use Apple Pay. It's going to be so much easier. So I'm sure we'll see the market shift.
And we've been talking to some possible partners for research in the future that is specific to mobile, where we make all our donations on mobile. Like we do the whole thing on mobile. And that would be one thing that for sure we would look for. So if you want that, let us know. And then we can maybe use that as we look at our research next year.
Another anecdotal piece of data on that topic, as we've kind of done some international workshops and, kind of explored what's happening in more international markets, tap pay is a big thing in Europe, and being able to, authenticate with your fingerprint on your phone and fill out a donation form that way. That's really commonplace outside of the United States. So in terms of payment options and that sort of thing, we tend to be a little bit behind, at least on the state side here. So I'm sure that we'll catch up to that.
Good point.
In a couple of years. Let's see. Another question from Kirsten asking about unnecessary fields. Is it okay to put, fields that you don't necessarily need to process a donation? Is it okay to put those maybe on the confirmation page or a follow-up page after the donation has been completed?
Yeah, that would be the suggestion. I think anytime we ask donors for information, we need to ask ourselves, why do I want to collect this information? How am I going to use it? And what is the benefit to the donor? Just to collect information because maybe 3 months from now we're going to use it isn't a good reason. So if you don't know what you're going to do with it, that's obviously, it should make sense. But if you don't know what you're going to do with it, so you need to know how you're going to use it, and particularly in the context of how does this help the donor. And that could be like making a more contextual ask in the future, customizing communications based on interest, or there are ways that we can use information to improve the donor experience. So as long as that's yes, then I think for sure we should be open to collecting that information. But yes, do it either sequentially, like on the confirmation page as a call to action, or you could do it in your welcome series. It's something that we're doing another study on, welcome series or cultivation in the first 45 days. And I've seen more organizations do it. Hey, take this short survey, and that's where they're trying to collect some of that information. So you can do it in other ways. I think the thing is, don't put it in the middle of your donation flow, because it's just kind of an odd thing to interact with in the moment. Get the donation and then, find other ways. And it could be a both end. Have it on the confirmation page. If they don't do it, you can include it in a survey. You can have an annual survey to update, things like that. Just be careful that donors will lie to you unintentionally, right? So what inspired your gift? It's so hard for us to know what actually inspired our gift. How did you hear about us? They maybe heard about you on Facebook 3 months ago, but this was from an email. So it's difficult. So like it's an insight, not proof or pure evidence. And then one question, just if you're going to ask you that I don't recommend, is how often do you want to hear from us, or even how? Because they'll say, don't send me an email, don't send me emails, or only, once every 6 months or something. And you're basically opting them into becoming a lapsed donor. Communication is the number one reason why people give again or lapse. And if you're letting them proactively select themselves out of communication, even though what they're saying is don't spam me, and that's great, you should be doing quality communications. But if you adhere to what they say, which then you have to do if you ask, you're basically kind of charting a path towards lapsed donor.
Good, that's insightful. Janine asked a question. I think it's kind of interesting and maybe a little bit challenging to some of the the typical way of thinking, at least for us. But she asked this: how about the Bernie Sanders approach? This isn't just unique to Bernie Sanders, but how about the Bernie Sanders approach of asking for smaller amounts, like $3? Any thoughts on that either acquisition approach or just fundraising approach?
Yeah, it is interesting. Where we ran into it, and I spent a lot more time thinking, was when we were actually in Spain, and when Greenpeace UK gave a presentation, which was awesome. And Greenpeace, and actually a lot of environmental organizations do this, where they have a very, very low ask amount. So a few things. One, if you have a really good follow-up strategy to thank donors, communicate with them, try to upgrade and grow, then my preferences or suggestion is take the donor, and then you can find out other ways to keep them, grow them, upgrade them. And if amount is an issue, then lower the amount. That makes a lot of sense. What I see with a lot of organizations, though, is they don't have the infrastructure, data, systems, tools to take advantage of that. So if you get a $3 donor and then you can't find a way to get another gift, like you're actually losing money on that transaction. So that's something. The other thing in the political sphere is what they often like to say, right, is 4 million people support. Like it's a trust mark thing. It helps them rally other supporters. So there's other reasons why they do that, even if they're taking a loss, right? They're trying to engage in other ways. So it's a complicated question. I think for recurring in particular, I'm an advocate of actually lowering the barrier there, because if someone gives $5, $7 a month over 2.5 years, they're probably going to end up giving a lot more than they would, even if you just had a $100 donation. So I think that applies more to recurring and less to one time. So that's a few kind of nuances in there, but I think a big thing to think about is what happens after the donation, or what's the upside or downside of really lowering that average gift. And there could be a really good reason, like in Bernie Sanders' case, and if you have the infrastructure, but I think it's a pretty risky proposition for most organizations to go really, really low.
Thanks, Brady. I think something interesting too in that political space that I've enjoyed watching some of the different tactics that happen in the fundraising approaches, as to how you make like upsell different offers and stuff like that within the donation flow. So that maybe as we get more into a election cycle, that may be something to watch and gather some test ideas from. So,
yeah, and I think the front side of political advocacy is really, really interesting, right? It's normally very immediate, very high pressure, very clear, very succinct. It's the back end where, it's like a scorched earth policy where they just bombard you with emails because they don't care if you unsubscribe, because they have got another cycle, you know? So there's a lot for us to learn, and they do a lot of testing, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of maybe not as good stuff as well.
Pick the good stuff, toss out the bad stuff.
Yeah.
Next question here. And I haven't read this one yet, so I'm kind of going through this. It's a newer one. Kim is saying that they are a membership organization. They tie the donation to a membership profile. Members are required to log in. Is this friction? Is this too much friction? Is it okay? How do you deal with that?
So, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. Like, there's a lot of caveats within there. So here's a few things that I would say based on what we've seen either through experiments or just kind of, you know, overall in what our research suggests. Generally speaking, requiring a login is huge friction, massive friction. So if you're using it to like, hey, then they can log in and manage their tax receipts, like nobody does that. Very few donors do that. Where it kind of makes more sense is maybe in a membership scenario. And child sponsorship potentially is another one. You can log in, get your updates from the child, change information, send electronic communication back and forth. So there are some kind of unique use cases where it makes more sense. I think the suggestion would still be, can you find a way to make that process easier? So either like a lazy registration where they can kind of create a login or a membership for the first time after they make a donation, right? Where you just carry through the email and say, hey, you know, just give us your password and you've got your account. Here's why you should do it. It's beneficial. Being able to, you know, work with different browsers or save information so that they can do like one-click logins or social logins or something. Just the more that you rely on them remembering a password for something that they probably don't use very much, it can be frustrating and it is friction-filled. So the general thing is use logins and registrations like very, very carefully because it causes a lot of problems. There are a few cases where it has made sense. And we do have an experiment where very committed donors who do log in, there was actually an increase in donations when the login was there, which was kind of shocking to us because we're like, man, that's so friction filled. But once they get over the hump of logging in, then it's actually much friction less because you have the information and you have the stuff. So it's something worth looking at. I know for a lot of organizations, they're trying to not tie membership specifically to donation because it is a deterrent. So they're like, here's membership, or you can make just a one-time gift, which you don't need an account and a login, and then they'll try to upgrade almost like a recurring. So you make $50 donation today. Thank you so much. You're awesome. Hey, did you know $50 gets a membership, or, you know, then you can do the value proposition that way. So again, you have to have a really motivated person who wants to become a member, create a login, things like that. So hopefully that's kind of useful. Yeah, that's how I'd answer.
Cool. A couple more questions here. We're going to try to wrap up by 2:30 here. If you need to go, that's fine. Feel free to do that. But if you want to stick around to hear these couple other questions, that's great too. We would love that. So here we go. A couple more. One from Anna. She's asking, do we see any difference between, you know, sending an auto receipt for a gift versus mailing something out? Is there friction in that process? Is there an ideal way to offer a thank you or a receipt? I think that's kind of the core question.
So stay tuned, because that's one thing that we're going to look specifically at is how organizations are thanking donors. But the general thing is that I think we confuse a lot is there's a difference between a receipt and a thank you. A receipt is very transactional. It's one of the nice things about online giving is it's pretty seamless where we can send out the receipt either immediately or some other time, but generally it happens immediately, which is great. But don't confuse the receipt as the thank you. So I think absolutely have an autoresponder and it should say thanks, you know, thank you, success, you're awesome, you've done a good job, attaches your receipt. That kind of ends the donor journey for that transaction to say it's complete. But then you have an opportunity to actually say thank you and kind of do the cultivation towards the next action, which could be something more profound, more personalized. You know, so don't conflate receipt as thank you. Those could go together. There should be a thank you with the receipt. But the more important thing is actually how you thank and start building kind of the reporting cultivation to the next gift. And so what we've seen, at least for other past studies, the more personal that kind of email can look, sound, and feel, the more it actually comes from a human as opposed to like no reply or info at. It feels better, but also has a higher chance of getting delivered and reaching kind of the inbox as opposed to a promotions tab or spam or something like that. So there's some advantages to that as well. So yeah, receipt doesn't equal thank you. Thanking is hugely important. And like most fundraising communication, the more kind of personal, human it looks, sounds, and feels, the better.
All right, rapid fire. We got 2 minutes. We're going to try to get through 4 questions.
I'll go quick.
Here we go. Question, and I think I understand this one. Marilyn, if I don't quite get it right, feel free to send me an email and clarify. I believe what she's asking is, can your donate page be 2 pages, 2 separate pages, or do you need to have the donation option on the 1 page?
It can be 2 pages. I think we haven't seen any evidence to say like it has to be 1 page or or 2 is even better. I think what we have seen is once you start getting above 3, you could be in trouble. So if you click donate and maybe you collect name, email, amount on step 1, and you click donate, and then it actually reloads, and then you put in the remaining information, that may be okay. I think our template and our guide is actually all 1 page and 1 step. So our default is, can you do it in 1 page? You might be able to get away with 2. Be careful about 3 or more.
Yeah, cool. Question from actually a couple of people now, from Kirsten, and I believe Paulette is asking this too. Should you put a little checkbox and ask people to cover the credit card fees? Yes or no?
Don't know, but no. That's a real rapid fire answer. We don't have a lot of evidence. I don't like it, and I've seen people say 50% of donors choose it. To me, that's irrelevant. Does it inspire a higher conversion rate or a larger average gift? And I have seen some elements of no. Their average gift goes down because they think part of their donation is already going to fees. So my default there is no, but I'm pretty open to see evidence. I just haven't seen enough evidence. If
you think it's great, put it to the test. Let us know how it turns out. And I think we've got time for one more here. Actually, a real quick one from Paulette. Is there a way to get credible trust marks so you don't have to create fake ones?
Yeah, Charity Navigator, GuideStar, those ones are pretty easy. GuideStar has multiple levels. So even if you're bronze, which is basically like you just like have an account and have some information, I think it's pretty easy to get bronze. And then there's like silver, gold, platinum, but even just showing bronze is one. Better Business Bureau, I think you need to be of a certain size for that one, and Charity Navigator, which might be harder to get. So GuideStar is probably easiest, but all of those ones are pretty possible.
Great. And then finally, last question, Nancy wants to know, are the organizations we've labeled as the best in this study, do they have the ability to customize forms? Their CRM seems to be a little less flexible. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I do think this is, again, technology is a limitation. So when we saw that size of organization is a factor, it's either a combination of they're not paying for a better tool, they don't have access to a developer who can customize it, or someone on staff who knows that. Again, huge assumption there, but we kind of have seen that anecdotally. So yes, I would say by the most part, better organizations have some ability to customize. But what I will say, and this is again why Raised Donors is a good tool for us, is the main thing that the tool should do is your form. That's the hardest thing. Like, they need to collect the information and process the gift. What happens before that, your value proposition, your message, what happens after, you can control so much of that just within your own website. Doesn't matter to your CRM and things like that. So the form is what's most important to us when it comes to tool selection, is how good is it? How flexible is it? How easy is it to integrate with other things? So yes, I would say in general, the great organizations have better tools or ability to customize them, but it shouldn't be that hard today, and Raised Donors is a good tool to do that.
Awesome. Well, that's going to wrap it up for today. I see, Marilyn, you're clarifying that question a little bit. I'll try to send you an email. And actually, if you email me too at Nathan@NextAfter, that'd be great. We can have a conversation, and then we'll figure that out. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for sticking around extra long to ask questions and really kind of dig in here. I think some next steps is we're going to take this research that Brady's in some ways only scratched the surface of. There's a lot more, and put this into a full-blown research study that you'll be able to download or get a physical copy at NEO Summit if you're able to come. And so all that is forthcoming. So thank you so much again for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Adios.